Hey guys, as we wind down tonight, we'll step back in time together to explore the strange and secretive world of Japanese courtesans and the crazy ways they dealt with pregnancies. You may think you'd feel right at home in this chapter of history, but you might not survive this one without a few surprises. So, before you settle in, please take a moment to give the video a like and hit subscribe if you're truly enjoying the journey. You can also leave a comment. Let me know where you are listening from and what time it is there. It's always a small wonder to see people tuning in from so many corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle hum in the background, and together, let's ease into tonight's story. You imagine the pleasure quarters as a place of lantern glow and perfumed silks, where every evening unfolded like a private theatre. But beneath the shimmering layers of brocade and powder was a different kind of reality, one that hummed with whispered bargains, secret anxieties, and the quiet weight of pregnancies no one was supposed to see. The courtesans called iron and Yujo lived in rooms thick with incense, where clients paid small fortunes for an evening's company. Yet even the most graceful among them were never free of biology's demands. A missed cycle was enough to tilt a career into crisis, to turn the soft rustle of silk into the hush of hidden shame. Their world was shaped by elaborate codes. A courtesan was expected to remain alluring and unencumbered, an image unbroken by swelling bellies or wailing infants. And so they relied on desperate measures, herbs and baths, midwives who did not ask too many questions, garments sewn with secret folds, and sometimes a quiet departure behind closed screens. Tonight, you'll drift through those corridors where every painted screen concealed another story, where every sweet-smelling sachet might have hidden something far less delicate. You'll find that beauty often came with a cost measured in secrecy, sacrifice, and silent endurance. And in this quiet hour, we'll trace the gentle outlines of that hidden life, one breath, one lantern lit step at a time. You step into the district of Yoshiwara at dusk, when the lanterns bloom to life like a field of cautious fireflies. The street is narrow, lined with wooden facades that have seen centuries of painted smiles and unspoken contracts. You think the air will be perfumed with something soft and floral. Instead, it smells of old sake, candle smoke, and the hidden fatigue of women trained to appear untouchable. Inside these tea houses and brothels, the courtesans glide across tatami floors in layers of silk so heavy they seem to pin their steps to the earth. Their hair rises in lacquered sculptures, adorned with tortoise-shell combs and kanzashi pins sharp enough to be weapons. You imagine their lives as glamorous performances. In truth, every gesture is rehearsed to protect their place and their survival. Pregnancy is not part of the script. A courtesan's value is tethered to illusion, youth, purity, and youthful ability. So when her body begins to betray her, she has little choice but to counter it with rituals as delicate as they are desperate. If you were one of them, you might have relied on emmenagogue's herbs whispered about behind closed sliding screens. Mugwort, pennyroyal, and safflower petals steeped into bitter infusions. You drink them in secret, hoping the taste of iron on your tongue signals a return to normal, not the start of something irreversible. The remedies are uncertain. Sometimes they work. Sometimes they bring more harm than any discreet midwife can undo. You think there must have been doctors kind, knowing, discreet. But midwives were often the only ones willing to risk their reputation. They came at night, carrying bundles of cloth and quiet instructions. If a pregnancy advanced too far, more extreme methods followed: manual extractions, invasive decoctions. No written records remain to measure the consequences, but the silences in the archives say enough. The courtesan could not simply leave her position. Debt bonded her to the house. The fees for training, clothing, and promotion were debts so enormous they seemed designed to ensure no woman would ever walk free. Pregnancy was a crack in the entire edifice, one that had to be concealed at all costs. And so, beneath the elaborate makeup white face powder that masked every blemish, there was always the private fear of discovery. You imagine the relief of unburdening the truth to someone trusted, but in Yoshiwara, even confessions were luxuries. You sit quietly in the small chamber as the courtesan closes the shoji behind her. She pours tea, hands trembling in a way that her painted face never reveals. You notice the faint swell beneath her robe, a detail you're not supposed to see. She doesn't look at you. She doesn't speak of it. The rules require that you both pretend it isn't there. The brazier glows in the corner, casting shadows that shift like memories. You watch her pour another cup. Perhaps you think she will drink it herself, but she passes it to you, her smile soft and practiced. Somewhere beyond the thin wooden wall, a shamisen begins to play, a melody so precise it sounds almost mechanical. And in this moment you understand beauty here is an armor, a performance polished to a mirror shine. But underneath, the truths grow quietly, like roots seeking water. And when the music fades, you rise to leave, careful not to look back. Tomorrow, the same ritual will unfold. The same secrets will press against the seams of every kimono. Next, you'll step outside into the night air, thinking perhaps it will feel fresh and liberating. But it clings to you, heavy with the knowledge you now carry. You follow the narrow corridor deeper into the brothel, your feet brushing across woven rush mats that smell faintly of ash and warm rice. You imagine every room is the same, perfumed, lacquered, lined with the pale glow of candlelight. But here, behind the last sliding door, the air shifts. This is the haraya, the hidden maternity room. Officially, it doesn't exist. No ledgers list its upkeep. No contracts mention its use. But every courtesan knows it waits for the day when the body can no longer pretend. You think it might look like a sick-room Spartan, clinical, cold, but the space is strangely soft, almost tender. A single futon on the floor, a lacquered basin for water, a folded screen painted with a pair of cranes, wings outstretched as if caught between flight and surrender. It is here that a woman could disappear for weeks, her absence explained as illness, perhaps a fever, never pregnancy. When the time came, the brothel's midwife would arrive at dawn, carrying her bundle of bandages and silent instructions. No announcements, no blessings, just a quiet nod that meant everything was about to change. If you were a courtesan, you might spend your final days of confinement reciting sutras under your breath, praying that the labor would pass without scandal or sorrow. Outside, life would continue. The clients would still drink sake. The other women would still paint their faces, smile, and pretend not to hear your cries behind the sliding screen. And when the child was born, there was no celebration, no naming ceremony. The infant would be wrapped in soft cotton, placed in the arms of a waiting attendant, and carried away sometimes to a temple orphanage, sometimes to a foster family in the countryside. The mother was not permitted to know exactly where. You might think there would be relief in the end, but more often there was only a hollow quiet. The courtesan would remain in the haraya for a few more days, recovering from the birth, the loss, and the knowledge that the debt remained unchanged. After all, even in absence, a woman's body continued to cost the house money. The elaborate kimonos, the lost earnings, the meals, every expense was recorded. When she returned to work, the debt ledger would be waiting, a reminder that no matter what she had lost, she still owed. And yet, despite the risk, pregnancies were inevitable. Clients refused condoms, animal bladder sheaths that were uncomfortable, unreliable, and insultingly suggestive. Instead, many men insisted that pregnancy was proof of virility, a mark of their potency, not the courtesan's vulnerability. You imagine the cruelty of that logic, how a single careless night could condemn a woman to weeks behind this painted screen. The cranes on the panel seemed to watch you, their eyes dark and indifferent. Some brothels prided themselves on discretion. A client might never learn his mistress had borne a child. He would return, week after week, to the same gentle performance, never suspecting the secret that had unfolded just a few rooms away. And when the courtesan finally emerged, she would be painted, perfumed and silent. No mention of where she had been. No acknowledgement of what had passed. In Yoshiwara, the show always resumed. Outside, the lanterns sway in the breeze, their light flickering like a promise you know can never be kept. You step into the hallway again, feeling the hush of that hidden room still clinging to your clothes. Soon, you'll pass another door, another life you'll never fully understand. And tomorrow, you'll come to believe you can simply forget. But the cranes will still be watching. You return to the main hall, where an old lacquered chest rests beneath the shrine of the household gods. From the outside, it looks ceremonial, perhaps a box for incense or offerings. But you already know what it contains. Inside is the ledger, heavy as regret, bound in dark leather. Each page is ruled in neat columns recording the debts of every woman who ever worked here. You think the ledger would be hidden in an office or locked away. Instead, it sits in plain view, a silent reminder that even beauty must be accounted for, line by line. If you were a courtesan, you would see your name there, written in careful brushstrokes. Next to it, the numbers, the cost of your training, your elaborate hairstyle, each bolt of brocade that drapes your shoulders. And in a separate column, the hidden tally fees for medical expenses, for absences, for unexpected interruptions of service. Pregnancy was an interruption, a failure to meet the expectations of the house. So every day in the maternity room added another sum to your debt: days you could not work, meals you consumed, the midwife's discreet visits. Even the cotton cloth in which the baby was wrapped appeared as an expense. You think the ledger must have felt like a threat, but in some way, it was also a promise. As long as your name was there, you belonged somewhere. You were accounted for. You had a place even if the cost was more than you could ever repay. Once, a courtesan named Akebono tried to buy her freedom. She had a patron, an older samurai, who had promised to redeem her contract. You imagine the moment she believed him, the fragile hope that her ledger would finally be closed. But when he disappeared, leaving only a folded letter and a single coin, she was returned to the house. The debt remained, swollen with interest. That was the quiet cruelty of Yoshiwara. You were never simply free. Every attempt to leave was measured, recorded, billed. Even the desire to escape became another line item. In these rooms, a courtesan learned not only how to forsake or recite a poem, she learned to keep her voice smooth while her mind calculated the months, the seasons, the sum that never seemed to shrink. And yet, some found a way to endure. They memorized the ledger as if it were a liturgy. They turned the numbers into a ritual, something predictable in a life ruled by secrets. You might think that clients never saw these accounts, but sometimes a wealthy man would ask to review the ledger before redeeming a contract. He would read through each expense, each hidden fee, as though tallying the worth of an exquisite object. And when he finally closed the book, the courtesan would bow, her face calm, while her heart measured the weight of her own life. You imagine that when the chest was opened at dawn, the paper smelled faintly of ink, rice starch, and the dampness of too many unspoken stories. Outside, the street vendors were already setting out baskets of dried persimmons. You could pretend that life was ordinary, that nothing hidden existed behind the shoji screens. But the ledger remained. It recorded everything, even the things no one dared to say aloud. And as you step back into the hall, you realize you have seen something you can never unsee. Tomorrow, the chest will be opened again. Another name will be added, another debt begun. You leave the ledger behind and step into a narrow dressing room where daylight filters through a latticed window. You think the light would feel clean, a small mercy in a place heavy with pretense. But it only highlights the layers of powder, the faint stains on the kimono hems, the quiet desperation in every measured gesture. This is where the courtesans prepared to re-enter the world as if nothing had changed, as if their bodies hadn't betrayed them, as if the ledger hadn't grown another line. Here, concealment was not only an art, it was a requirement for survival. When a pregnancy advanced too far for herbs or rituals to reverse, the brothel provided specialized garments called okami, sashes sewn with extra folds to smooth the guts. A heavily padded obi tied high across the waist could disguise even the later months, turning a hidden child into nothing more than an illusion of rounded fabric. You imagine the moment a courtesan bound herself into the garment. The hush as the attendant pulled the silk taut, knotting the sash in a pattern so precise it left no room for accident. You think it would feel comforting to be held that way, but more often it felt like a shrinking cage. The kimono was layered in deliberate contradiction, soft against the skin, heavy on the shoulders, unyielding over the abdomen. And when she walked, every step was trained to seem effortless. A client could rest his gaze on her form, never suspecting the truth she carried beneath the brocade. Sometimes concealment meant more than a garment. Courtesans adopted subtle gestures, a hand resting lightly on the sash, a seated posture that hid the lap, an artful drape of the outer robe. Each movement rehearsed until it looked casual, inevitable. You think such constant vigilance would break a person, and sometimes it did. But in Yoshiwara, there was no refuge for those who faltered. A woman who could no longer disguise her pregnancy might be retired early, her debt transferred to her family or her child, one more inheritance no one wanted. There were whispers that some courtesans had mastered the art so completely they delivered children in secret, returning to work within days. You hear these stories and wonder whether they are tales of resilience or simply further proof of how little choice there was. Even in ukiyo-e prints, the famous floating world woodblocks, you can see hints of this concealment, though you must look carefully. A courtesan with a slightly stiff gait, her sleeves falling in ways that seem unnatural, a face turned just enough to hide exhaustion. These details remain, quiet signatures etched into the archive. Outside, clients waited, unaware or unwilling to see. They arrived with poems and coins, expecting the same performance. And every evening, the women returned to the stage, their hidden burdens bound beneath polished layers. You watch one of them preparing, her reflection caught in a polished copper mirror. She adjusts the edge of her sleeve, smooths the folds of the obi, and studies her own gaze as if searching for a crack. Perhaps she imagines she can simply step out into the corridor and forget that the borrowed grace of silk will be enough to protect her. You think it might be. But when she finally rises, you can see the small tremor in her hands, a reminder that the body always remembers what the mind hopes to erase. Outside, the lanterns have been lit again. The hour grows late, and you realize concealment is not simply a skill, it is the price of remaining. You find her sitting by the brazier, her silhouette drawn in small, precise lines against the woven screen. The midwife Samba is older than most of the courtesans, her back curved, her hair streaked with iron grey. You imagine she must have been a figure of comfort, the one woman in the house allowed to speak plainly. But here, comfort was a transaction, same as anything else. If you were a courtesan, you would have learned early that the midwife was not simply a healer. She was a keeper of secrets, a negotiator between shame and survival. Her hands smelled of rice vinegar and camphor. Her sleeves were always damp from washing. She arrived without ceremony and left the same way. When a pregnancy could not be ended with herbs, it was she who arranged everything, summoned the house matron, prepared the hidden room, lit the coals to boil water. You think she would have been gentle. Sometimes she was. Sometimes there was no time for gentleness. The tools she carried were wrapped in a cloth the colour of old ivory. Inside, a slender bamboo probe, cotton thread, small iron shears, implements of birth or of something else. You imagine the fear that would pass between her and the woman she was tending. Neither one permitted to name it aloud. She kept no written records. Perhaps she couldn't read. Perhaps she simply understood that paper was too dangerous. All her knowledge lived in her memory, catalogued by the faces of women who had held her hand, cried into her sleeve, or left her chamber without another word. You watch her now as she threads a needle, her fingers slow and sure. When the house is quiet, she sometimes hums under her breath old melodies carried from the villages where she learned her craft. There were stories about her. Some said she knew the herbs that could end a pregnancy before the first signs. Others claimed she could disguise any birth as a miscarriage if the payment was right. You think such power would feel reassuring. But in Yoshiwara, it made her as feared as she was respected. When a courtesan was sent to her, she understood what it meant, the end of something, the beginning of another debt, a hush that could not be broken. Clients never saw the midwife. If they passed her in the corridor, they pretended she was invisible, but the women knew. They watched her from behind lowered lashes, calculating the cost of her visit. You think she must have grown numb after so many years. But sometimes, when she believed no one was watching, her shoulders would fall, and she would hold the cloth-wrapped tools with an expression you could almost mistake for sorrow. In this world, even the person who delivered life also delivered silence. You step back as she rises to tend a kettle. Steam curls around her like a veil. For a moment you glimpse the curve of her cheek in the lantern light. It is not pity you see there. It is something closer to acceptance. Perhaps she no longer believes in endings, only in continuations, one birth leading to another, one debt folding into the next, one woman replacing the one who left. And as you slip from the room, you know she will remain, waiting by the brazier, her hands prepared for the next arrival. You return to the front parlour, where the courtesans sit in their layers of silk, their faces turned politely toward the doorway. You think you can read their expressions: boredom, composure, a flicker of curiosity. But you are only seeing the surface. Behind each still gaze lies the same quiet understanding. Sooner or later, every woman here will disappear behind a screen. They called it kakura, the hiding. A ritual as established as any tea ceremony, but never spoken of in daylight. If you were a courtesan nearing the time when your secret could no longer be hidden, you would perform a final evening in the public rooms. You would paint your face as perfectly as ever, white powder layered to mask any flush, rouge brushed across your lips with the same careful strokes you learned as a girl. You would serve sake, laugh at jokes, and tilt your head in practiced attentiveness. The clients never suspected, or pretended not to. A courtesan who vanished was explained away as ill, invited to rest by the house's generosity. You think this fiction would feel humiliating, but in Yoshiwara it was strangely merciful. If no one named your condition, you could pretend it was something else. The final rituals were subtle. You bowed longer when a customer left. You touched the hem of your kimono as though measuring how it would fit tomorrow. You spoke a little more softly, as though rehearsing absence. At dawn, an attendant would enter your chamber with a folded robe, plain, unpatterned, the colour of ash. It was the opposite of your usual garments, a sign you were no longer part of the house's display. You think you might feel grief pulling it over your shoulders, but many women described a curious relief, as if they had been permitted to set down a burden they had carried too long. You walked through the house with your gaze lowered. No one stopped you. No one called your name. The same attendants who had dressed you in brocade and combed your hair now looked away. Silence was the only dignity left. Some courtesans returned weeks later, painted again, their absence never acknowledged. Others did not. A few vanished into marriage or rural anonymity, their debts purchased by a patron or forgiven by a brothel willing to cut its losses. Most were simply replaced. Another young woman would don the same silks, learn the same phrases, smile with the same guarded eyes. You think the clients might have noticed the change, but the illusion of continuity was stronger than any individual memory. As long as the rituals remained intact, the story continued uninterrupted. In the narrow alley behind the brothel, the ash-coloured robe was said to trail across the ground, picking up dust and stray leaves. The woman wearing it felt her body lighter, her debt heavier, her mind clearer than it had been in years. When she reached the small side gate, she paused. You imagine her standing there, one hand on the wooden frame, the other clutching the robe at her throat. You think she must have felt something final in that moment. And then she stepped through, the door sliding closed with a sound so soft it could have been mistaken for a sigh. You turn away from the gate and walk back toward the lanterns. The street feels unchanged, vendors calling out, shadows drifting across the paper walls. But you know something has shifted. You have seen the ritual of disappearance. You will not forget it. You sit again in the receiving room, your back warmed by a charcoal brazier, your eyes drawn to the lacquered door that separates the world of visitors from the world of Disse. You think this door must mark a clear boundary, but in truth it is more like a membrane, porous, ambiguous, a place where transactions masquerade as affections. Here the patron arrives. He removes his sandals with a slow precision, as if each movement declares his authority. He carries no ledger, no ink brush, yet everyone knows he is the only man permitted to change the numbers recorded in the debt book. If you were a courtesan, you would recognize the rituals of this encounter. The lowered eyes, the polite greetings, the soft exchange of seasonal pleasantries. Only when the attendants have withdrawn does the real conversation begin. Perhaps he is an older samurai with the smell of horse and ink on his robes. Perhaps he is a rice merchant whose wealth is newer, more brittle. Either way, the same offer lingers in the hush between sentences: redemption. You think it must have sounded like a promise, and sometimes it was. A man could pay the sum of your debt and release you from the brothel, but redemption was rarely simple. The fee was enormous years of expenses calculated down to each hairpin and scrap of silk. For most patrons, it was a sum that hurt to consider, a wound in the purse that never quite healed. So they bargained. They delayed. They promised next season, next harvest, next time. And in the meantime, you continued to serve, your body pledged to a freedom that might never arrive. Some men never intended to redeem their courtesans. They liked the illusion more than the reality, the power of being the savior without paying the price. You think that would feel cruel, and it was. But the women learned to expect it. There were other bargains too. A child conceived in secrecy could become a lever. If the patron acknowledged paternity, he might feel compelled to pay the debt, to transform a contract into a marriage. But more often, the child was an inconvenience, a reason to withdraw, to pretend no promise had ever been spoken. You think the courtesan must have resented him? Perhaps she did. But in Yoshiwara, resentment was a luxury. Survival required the appearance of gratitude, even devotion. There were exceptions, stories of men who kept their word. A retired official who paid every coin owed and took his mistress to a small house outside the city. A merchant who raised his children openly, letting them inherit both name and fortune. But these stories circulated like folk tales, repeated to soften the reality everyone knew. Most bargains were broken before they began. You watch as the patron lifts the cup she has poured for him. His fingers brush hers in a gesture rehearsed 100 times. You think he looks satisfied, perhaps even fond. But you also see how her eyes flicker toward the ledger hidden behind the folding screen. When he leaves, he pauses by the doorway. His voice is soft as he murmurs that she must be patient, that all debts are settled in time. You think she believes him. But when the door slides shut, you see her shoulders fall by the width of a single breath, and you understand that in this place, even hope must be worn like an ornament, beautiful, fragile, and easily shattered. Outside, the lanterns have burned low. The wind carries the scent of night soil and plum blossoms. You step into the darkness, carrying the shape of her silence in your mind. You walk past the sliding screens to a small storeroom, tucked behind the kitchen. You think it will smell of old rice and damp straw, but as the door creaks open, the air is pungent with something sharper: dried leaves, bitter roots, and the faint metallic scent of old iron pots. This is where the herbs are kept. The shelves are lined with clay jars and folded packets of paper tied with twine. No labels mark them. No records explain their uses. But every woman in the house knows what each bundle is for. If you were a courtesan, you would have learned to recognize them by their shapes, their smells. Mugwort, dark and feathery. Safflower petals, a bruised red that clings to your fingertips. Dogban, with its sour green tang that makes you hesitate before bringing it to your mouth. The herbal mixtures were not merely folk remedies. They were the first line of defense against the consequences of a life no one was allowed to name aloud. You imagine taking the packet in your hand, how light it would feel, how it could change everything. A few pinches of powder stirred into warm sake. A cup sipped in the privacy of your chamber. And then the waiting. Hours of it. Sometimes days. Watching your own body for the sign you both dreaded and prayed for. You think there must have been certainty. But in truth, the results were unreliable, and the price of failure was steep. A pregnancy that persisted meant the risk of exposure, seclusion, and a deeper debt, and so the women measured and remeasured, seeking the right proportion that might spare them. The midwife kept her own private stock recipes older than the brothel itself. She never explained them, only dispensed what she believed necessary, her face unreadable as she pressed the packet into a trembling palm. Sometimes the herbs worked swiftly. Sometimes they did nothing at all. And sometimes they worked too well, leaving a woman fevered, writhing on the futon while the attendants wiped her brow in silence. You think such outcomes would end the practice, but there was no alternative. In the floating world, a courtesan's body was her livelihood, her burden, and her only weapon. To surrender it to chance was unthinkable. You watch as an attendant gathers a small jar from the top shelf. She cradles it with a care usually reserved for porcelain. You wonder if she too has memorized which jars are for easing pain, which for ending possibility. When she leaves, the air seems to hold its breath, as though the shelves themselves carry the memory of every desperate calculation. Outside, a rooster crows in the pre-dawn dark. You think the sound should feel hopeful, the promise of morning. But in this room, it only marks another day of choices made behind closed screens. You step out, your hand brushing the doorframe. For a moment, you feel the texture of old cedar against your fingertips, the same wood touched by countless others who came here seeking the same uncertain relief. And when the door closes, the scent of bitter herbs clings to you, a reminder that in Yoshiwara, even hope was measured in doses, weighed on a scale no one could ever fully see. You slip through the side corridor, where the floorboards creak under your weight, and pause beside the back gate. You think it will feel like any other threshold. But this door is different. It is the line between secrecy and surrender. When a courtesan's child was carried away, this was where the transfer happened. No ceremony. No formal farewell. Just the faintest hush as the matron bowed and turned her face aside. If you were standing here, you would see the attendant cradling a bundle swaddled in plain cotton. The baby often slept through this part, unaware that its life was already shaped by debts it could not name. Beyond the gate, a litter waited, sometimes hired by a patron who wished to avoid the gossip of the main thoroughfare, sometimes dispatched by a temple orphanage. You think the orphanage would feel comforting, like a haven. But it was simply the next step in a chain of quiet removals. In the archives of Edo, you can find the record's thin, almost apologetic notations, delivered to the temple, taken into care, fostered in the countryside. No mention of names, only dates and the payment received for the child's upkeep. Sometimes the children were adopted by rural families, farmers who needed an extra pair of hands. Sometimes they were raised in the temple dormitories, their lineage never spoken of again. And sometimes they did not survive the first winters. You imagine the courtesan in her chamber, listening for the footsteps that would signal the child's departure. She would not be permitted to watch. She might not even be told when it was done. In the weeks that followed, she would return to her place in the receiving room, painted and poised, while her thoughts traveled to the small body she once carried. You think the separation would break her. And sometimes it did. But in Yoshiwara, grief was a private indulgence. On the rare occasion when a patron claimed paternity, the story unfolded differently. The child might be acknowledged, the mother's debt redeemed. But more often, the same litter carried the same quiet burden through the same unremarkable streets. The temple records were methodical. Each entry was signed by a scribe whose name no one remembers. The ink has faded, but the entries remain, a ledger of disappearances. You step outside and follow the path that leads away from the gate. The road is narrow, lined with hedges that almost conceal the view. Perhaps that was the point, so no one had to see what was carried away. A breeze stirs the leaves overhead. You think it should feel cleansing, but it only scatters the dust into your sleeves. The away memories drift into places you thought were safe. At the end of the lane, the orphanage gates stand closed. A wooden plaque bears the temple's name, the paint flaking under years of rain. You pause there, one hand resting on the worn lintel, and wonder how many stories ended here without a single witness. And when you turn back toward the city, the air feels heavier, as though the quiet of the place has settled around your shoulders, refusing to be shaken off. You trace your way back through the alleys of Yoshiwara, your footsteps soft on the beaten earth. You think the air would feel lighter now that you've stepped beyond the back gate, but the weight remains, pressed into your shoulders like an unspoken confession. At the main entrance, the lanterns sway overhead, painted with symbols of the house, their glow trembling in the evening wind. You pause beneath them, imagining how many nights have begun and ended here, how many faces have turned upward in hope or dread. If you were a courtesan returning after weeks of seclusion, this is where you would stop to gather yourself. You would pull the robe tighter, test your voice with a polite greeting, Practice the smile that must look effortless. You think the first steps back would feel familiar, but they never did. When a woman emerged after childbirth or confinement, she did so to a world that pretended nothing had changed. The clients never asked where she had been. The attendants never spoke of what they had seen. Only the ledger, hidden behind the folding screen, bore witness to the truth. Your eyes drift to the shop fronts across the street, vendors arranging trays of grilled fish, a boy sweeping dust from the doorstep. You think they look indifferent, but they know. Everyone in this quarter knows. The floating world is built on silences that never quite hold. You watch as a young courtesan steps into the doorway. Her kimono is patterned with chrysanthemums, her hair bound with lacquered combs that shimmer under the lantern glow. From a distance, she looks no different than she did before. But when she moves, you notice the faintest hesitation a moment, when her hand rests over her belly, as though checking it is truly empty. No one mentions it. No one dares. Inside, the rooms are prepared. The charcoal brazier has been relit, the tea set arranged with a care that borders on reverence. You think such details are meant to comfort her, but in truth, they are simply signals the performance must resume. She bows to the attendants who guided her return. They bow back, their faces smooth and unreadable. You wonder if they see her as a survivor or simply the next transaction. You step aside as she passes, and for a breath, her gaze meets yours. It is not accusation or pleading you find there, only the quiet certainty of someone who has learned that endurance is the only gift she can claim. You think you will forget this moment, that the street and the lanterns will swallow the memory. But already, you know it will return when the night is too quiet, when the scent of burnt cedar drifts through an open window. The lanterns flicker, their glow unsteady in the rising wind. And as you turn away, you understand that in Yoshiwara, nothing truly disappears. It only slips behind a screen, waiting to be revealed again. You begin your walk along the main street of Yoshiwara, the rows of wooden facades rising like a quiet procession of masks. You think the district must have felt glamorous, with its coloured banners and the hush of silk slippers passing in the dusk. But beneath the painted surfaces lay something harder, something that never loosened its grip. If you were a courtesan, you did not simply work here. You belonged here body, future, and every thought you dared not say aloud. The brothel was called the Aegya, the House of Assignations. From the street it looked almost serene, neat lattice work, a low lantern by the door, the name painted in discreet black strokes. But inside, every hallway was a reminder that your life was not your own. Upon your arrival, often as a girl of 12 or 13, you were brought to the house matron. She recorded your name, your birthplace, the name of the agent who sold your contract. No ceremony marked this entry. No blessing was offered. Only the quiet scratching of a brush on paper, sealing your future into a book you would never be permitted to read. You think the matron must have looked severe, and she often did, but hers was a kind of severity sharpened by necessity. She managed dozens of women, each with her own ledgers, her own small rebellions, her own hidden despairs. In the attic storeroom, the brothel kept the chests that held the kimonos, the combs, the hair ornaments. Each piece meticulously catalogued, each one a debt you had just inherited. You would wear them later, draped in beauty you could never afford. Every cup of tea poured for a client, every painted fan unfolded in greeting, every polite laugh added a fraction to the total you owed. And if you were ever tempted to imagine escape, the matron would remind you kindly, softly, that every piece of your life here came with a price. When a pregnancy was suspected, it was the matron who decided what would happen next, whether the midwife would be called, whether you would vanish behind a sliding screen, whether the debt would grow by a sum large enough to bind you for years beyond your youth. You might think such control would break your spirit outright. But in Yoshiwara, it was simply the air you learned to breathe. Some girls found small comforts, a favourite comb, a scrap of poetry copied onto rice paper and hidden in a sleeve, a quiet friendship with another woman who understood that nothing here was truly private. At the end of each month, the accounts were read aloud in the back room. You sat in a line with the others, hands folded, faces lowered, listening as the sums were recited your name, the amounts the remaining balance. You think it must have felt like a punishment, but to some, it was a relief to hear the truth spoken plainly, even if only in numbers. And when the reading ended, you bowed to the matron. You stood, adjusted your robe, and stepped back into the hall where the clients waited, none of them suspecting how many debts you carried hidden beneath the brocade. Outside, the paper lanterns began to glow, casting thin circles of light onto the street. You think the sight would feel hopeful, a promise that tomorrow could be different. But in this place, tomorrow was always the same. And as you turn away, the matron's voice seems to follow, soft and unwavering. Remember, everything has a cost. You stand in the doorway of the dressing chamber, watching as the courtesans prepare for the evening. You think the process must have felt comforting, an orderly ritual that restored a sense of control. But the truth was gentler and more ruthless all at once. Every layer of their attire was designed to do two things, to attract and to conceal. If you were among them, you would rise before dawn to begin the slow transformation. First came the linen underrobe, soft against the skin but already heavy with the faint dampness of summer. Then the layers of coloured silk, folded and draped with a precision so exact it bordered on superstition. Each hue was dictated by season, each pattern by rank. Chrysanthemums for autumn, plum blossoms for early spring, wisteria for the weeks when the rains returned. You think it must have felt beautiful to wear so many symbols, but sometimes the weight of them pressed so close to the skin that breathing itself became a performance. When a pregnancy began to show, the kimonos were selected more carefully. Darker colours, heavier weaves, sashes tied higher across the waist to blur the curve of the belly. A layer of padded fabric slipped beneath the outer robe, stitched by the matron's own hands. These were the seasons of disguise. An older courtesan, her face as pale as rice flour, would stand beside you as you dressed, her voice low and practiced. "Hold your shoulders straighter," she would say. "Breathe shallowly." You might think she was cold, but if you looked closely you would see the same lessons had been etched into her bones long ago. When the clients arrived, they noticed none of this. They saw only the surface, the gleam of the lacquered hairpins, the deliberate softness of your smile. They believed in the illusion because it was easier than considering what lay beneath it. And so you learned to glide across the tatami, the layers of silk muffling the shape of your body, your hands resting lightly over the sash, as though in thought. In the late hours of the evening, you would return to the dressing room, the kimonos damp with the sweat of concealment. You think undressing would feel like freedom, but it was only a brief intermission before the next performance. The discarded garments were hung to air in the cedar closet, each fold examined for stains or frayed edges. Even the faintest mark of wear was noted, charged, and recorded in the ledger you would never see. You imagined the quiet of this room, when the doors slid shut, the smell of old wood and incense, the soft hiss of the brazier cooling in the corner. Here you were allowed to unbind the sash, to let your shoulders fall. But even in this small privacy, the disguise never fully dissolved. The courtesans learned to hold themselves carefully, as though the watchers remained hidden behind every panel. Outside, the first fireflies flickered along the drainage ditch, their lights reflected in the shallow water. You think the sight would feel peaceful, a reminder that life continued beyond these walls. But when you step into the night air, the lanterns behind you still glow small, patient witnesses to every secret you carried beneath the silk. You return to the receiving room, where the paper lanterns cast thin circles of light across the tatami. You think the glow would feel warm, but tonight it only sharpens every outline: the lacquered trays, the porcelain cups, the faces turned politely toward the door. This is where the commerce of paternity began. If you were a courtesan, you would learn to read every pause in a client's voice, every small indulgence he allowed himself, a gift that cost too much, a question asked with a careful softness, a promise offered when he believed no one else could hear. Sometimes, a patron would take the first steps toward acknowledging a child he had fathered, a private conversation with the matron, an envelope of coin placed discreetly on the lacquered tray. The language was always the same: for her comfort, for her recovery, for the future. You might think these gestures were merciful, But in truth, they were negotiations, small wagers that determined who would pay, who would remember, who would be permitted to forget. If the pregnancy could be concealed, the brothel preferred it. A courtesan was more profitable when she remained available in the client's imaginations. But when concealment failed, the choice fell to the man who had visited so often that he claimed a kind of ownership no contract could codify. You think the decision would be clear, but more often it was delayed, deferred, reduced to polite phrases and waiting. There were men who acknowledged their children openly. They arranged for the infants to be sent to relatives in the countryside, paid the matron for lost earnings, and occasionally offered to redeem the mother's debt. Such gestures were rare enough to be retold in whispers, cautionary tales about the cost of sentiment. More often, a courtesan returned to her place after confinement, the ledger swollen with new debts, and the man who had once promised everything slipped quietly to another house. In the private ledgers, paternity appeared as a line item, discretion fee, midwife services, special arrangements. You think such words must have sounded dignified, but they were only shorthand for something no one dared to speak aloud. When the topic of the child was raised, if it was raised, it was always described in the passive voice. It was arranged. It was seen to. No names. No lineage. Only a polite vagueness that made forgetting possible. One evening, you watch as a patron lingers longer than usual. His cup remains untouched. His eyes drift to the folded screen that conceals the account books. You think he is about to speak, to finally declare something real. But when the moment comes, he only murmurs that the chrysanthemums are late this year, and the courtesan bows, her face smooth as lacquer. You see the smallest tremor in her hands as she adjusts her sleeve. Later, when she is alone, she sits by the brazier and unfolds a scrap of cloth, a child's swaddling band she was never permitted to keep. She traces the edge of the fabric as though it still held warmth. You think such a gesture would break her, but in Yoshiwara, this small, hidden grief was the only part of herself she could claim without permission. Outside, the lanterns flicker in the wind. The street is quiet, the shadows softening every boundary. You step back, the memory of her hands on the cloth settling into the space between your ribs. You return to the matron's office, a narrow room lined with shelves stacked high with ledgers. You think the air would smell of old ink and paper. It does, but also of something quieter, something like resignation. This is where absence was turned into numbers. If you were a courtesan who had been secluded for pregnancy or recovery, this was where the tally would be settled. Not with questions or blame, just the careful movement of the brush across rice paper. The matron sat behind a lacquered desk, her sleeves folded neatly over her lap. When you entered, you bowed low enough that your forehead nearly touched the floor. No words were exchanged. Words were dangerous here, too easily twisted into obligations no one wanted to honor. Instead, she would slide a thin slip of paper across the desk. It bore your name, the date of your return, and the amounts owed. You think it must have looked like any other receipt, but to you, it was a summation of all the hours spent behind the painted screens, all the breaths held in silence, midwife's fee, extra meals, lost earnings, each line measured not only in coin but in days you would never reclaim. You might imagine the ledger as a ledger alone, neutral, impartial. But in Yoshiwara, it was something closer to a second body, always present, always growing, impossible to leave behind. Sometimes the matron paused before reading the total. You think she did this out of pity, but more likely it was a way to allow the moment to land with dignity. Even here a ritual was observed. When she spoke the final figure, you nodded without protest. It would not change. A challenge would only risk punishment or further debt. Outside the window, you could hear the cries of the hawkers' dried persimmons, rice cakes, sandalwood incense. Their voices drifted through the lattice like reminders that the world continued without you. After the accounting, you were given a fresh kimono, sometimes older, sometimes newly stitched. It did not matter. What mattered was that you returned to the hall, looking as though nothing had passed. You might think the first evening back would feel like a kind of re-entry, but more often it felt like stepping into a story already halfway told, your absence a blank no one dared to fill. The clients never asked where you had been. If they noticed the slight pallor in your cheeks, the new hesitancy in your voice, they pretended not to see. The illusion depended on forgetting, and in this place, forgetting was an art as practiced as any dance. That night, you poured sake for a man whose name you did not remember. He smiled at you with the contentment of someone unaware of the ledger hidden in your sleeve. You thought, for a moment, that he looked almost kind. But kindness was as transient as the lantern light, fading the moment the door closed behind him. Later, when you returned to your room, you unfolded the slip of paper one last time. Your thumb traced the inked numbers, the small, relentless arithmetic of everything you could not undo. Outside, the lanterns flickered and went out, one by one, until the corridor was swallowed in darkness. You think the darkness should feel empty, but it was crowded with everything you had carried back inside. You pass once more into the quietest part of the house, a small chamber behind the kitchen, where the midwife kept her own records. You think the place must feel secretive, but it does not. It feels inevitable. The walls were lined with shelves no higher than your chest, each one stacked with folded cloths, small jars sealed in wax, and narrow ledgers bound with twine. Unlike the brothel's accounts, these books were never read aloud. They were not for the matron. They were not for the clients. They were for the midwife alone. If you were a courtesan who had entered this room in need, you would have watched her untie the ledger's cord with hands stained from the tinctures she brewed. She did not look at you when she wrote. She looked at the page, her brush moving with the calm of someone who no longer hoped for surprises. In her ledger, nothing was written in plain language. You think it must have been a code one she devised herself. Small pictographs, stray numbers, single characters that meant everything to her and nothing to anyone else. A sprig of mugwort drawn beside a date. A simple mark shaped like a crescent moon. A series of vertical strokes that might have stood for names or debts, or perhaps only time passing. You imagine the comfort it must have given her to keep this record, to trace the lines of her own work without interference. But you also sense the sorrow in it, a chronicle of women's quiet disappearances, tallied without ceremony. When she finished writing, she would blot the ink with a scrap of cloth and tuck the book back into its place. She did not lock it away. She did not need to. No one wished to open it. On some nights, when the corridors fell silent, she would sit by the brazier and turn the pages herself. You think she did this to remember. But perhaps she was only trying to convince herself that the ledger had a purpose, that the record of all those herbs, all those births and endings, meant something more than survival. Once, you watched her trace a finger over an old entry. She did not smile. She did not weep. She simply closed the book and rested her palm on the cover, as if steadying something that wanted to rise. When dawn came, she rose before anyone else. She stirred the coals, prepared the kettle, wrapped her tools in the same square of faded cloth. No ceremony. No complaint. You think such discipline would feel hollow after so many years, but perhaps it was the only dignity left to her to be the keeper of these hidden stories, even if no one ever asked her to tell them. Outside, the first carts rattled over the cobbles, carrying fish and straw mats and bundles of green onions. The world resumed its ordinary rhythms, indifferent to the quiet inside this small room. When you step away, you notice the faint scent of dried mugwort rising from the shelf. You think it should fade quickly, but as you pass back through the doorway, it clings to your sleeve, small reminder that in Yoshiwara, nothing was ever fully erased. You pass through the dressing chamber, where a row of polished copper mirrors stands propped against the wall. You think they must be there to reflect beauty. But in Yoshiwara, they were also a kind of rehearsal practicing the face you needed to wear. If you were a courtesan, this was where you came to make yourself visible again after absence. Your hair was combed and pinned in place, your skin dusted with rice powder so pale it seemed to erase any trace of the past weeks. The attendant moved behind you, her fingers quick as she arranged each fold of your kimono. In the mirror, you watched her hands, never your own face. That came last. You think this process would feel restorative, a return to who you were before. But it was only another transformation. The body had changed, and the mirror could not quite be made to lie. When you finally lifted your eyes, The reflection was familiar but different. The cheeks were a little thinner, the mouth curved in the same practiced smile. Yet somewhere beneath the powder, you could almost see the hush of what had happened, the faint suggestion that not everything could be concealed. And so you learned to look without looking, your gaze fixed on the place between your reflection's eyes, not meeting it fully, not daring to see too much. The mirrors themselves had seen everything. Women returning pale and quiet. Others leaving with their hair unpinned and their sleeves folded for the last time. You imagine the glass held all these images, layered like old paint, never scraped clean. Sometimes, an older courtesan would pause before the mirror long after everyone else had left. She would stand there in the dim light, her hands folded over her belly, her expression so still you almost believed she had turned to stone. You think she must have been remembering, but perhaps she was only measuring the distance between the person she was expected to be and the one she still carried inside her skin. When your turn came, you placed both hands on your knees, bowed your head, and waited as the attendant smoothed the last fold into place. Only then were you permitted to rise and study the face you would present to the world. No one ever asked if you were ready. Readiness was not part of the bargain. Outside the chamber, the voices of clients drifted up from the hall's soft laughter, the clink of cups on lacquered trays. The life you were expected to resume waited only a few paces away. You think the mirrors would feel accusatory, but they did not. They were simply indifferent, reflecting whatever you needed them to reflect. As you turned to leave, you caught a final glimpse of your own eyes, and in that fraction of a second, you saw both the girl who had first walked through the brothel's gate and the woman who no longer pretended she could leave unchanged. The lanterns outside cast a pale glow across the threshold. You stepped over it without hesitation, the mirrors behind you returning to their patient vigil. You pass along the corridor to the storeroom, where a low table holds a shallow lacquered tray. You think it might contain offerings for the shrine, or the remnants of last night's tea. But in this house, even the smallest things have been tallied, catalogued, and quietly assigned value. If you were a courtesan, you would know this tray by another name, the ledger of small indulgences. Every sweet you accepted, every pot of scented oil, every packet of incense, it all found its way into the account book. Even the simplest comforts were considered advances against your freedom. When you returned after absence, the matron would offer you these gifts with a face so serene you almost believed in her kindness. A comb of smooth horn, a twist of plum candy wrapped in waxed paper, a tiny sachet of powdered rice flour. You think such gestures must have felt generous, but each came with its price, recorded in careful ink strokes before you ever touched them. Sometimes, a patron requested these gifts be given in his name, a way to remind you he still claimed part of you. Other times they were simply house expenses. The distinction was never clarified. You imagined the quiet arithmetic of these exchanges. How many sweets equaled another week of service? How many combs measured out another season you would never reclaim? In the evenings you would slip the candy into your mouth while you waited to be called to the receiving room. The sweetness felt startling against your tongue, a brief illusion that you were someone else in another life. But even as you swallowed, you knew that the sugar was not free. Nothing in Yoshiwara was ever free. There were women who learned to refuse the tray altogether. They would bow their heads and murmur that they needed nothing. The matron never argued. She simply made a note in the ledger, declined. Even refusal became another entry, another measure of your worth. You think this constant accounting must have been exhausting, and it was. But over time, it became as natural as breathing. You learned to calculate without appearing to count, to receive without appearing to hope. On some nights, you caught yourself imagining the ledger as a living thing, quietly growing fat on every sip of tea and every folded scrap of silk, a creature you fed with each polite acceptance. Once you watched an older courtesan unwrap a tiny parcel of sugar-dusted beans. She lifted one to her lips, then paused. For a moment her eyes closed, as if she were tasting not the sweetness, but all the debts that sweetness carried. She ate it anyway. When she looked up, her smile was as perfect as ever, the last trace of bitterness hidden beneath the same lacquered composure she had worn since she was your age. Outside, the wind pressed against the paper screens. You thought it might blow the tray from the table, scatter everything across the floor, erase the accounts you could never repay. But when you stepped into the hallway again, the ledger remained, as fixed and patient as the house itself. You slip out the side entrance at dusk, careful not to let the wooden door creak too loudly. You think the night air will feel cleansing, that it will peel the day's weight from your skin. But as you step into the narrow alley, you find it only clings to you in a different shape. If you were a courtesan, you would have known this hour as the briefest reprieve when the lanterns had not yet been lit, and the clients had not yet arrived in earnest. A sliver of time when you could walk unnoticed. Almost. Your robe is plain, the colour of unpolished stone, a deliberate contrast to the lacquered splendour you will wear later. You pull it tighter across your chest as you pass the small shops already shuttered for the evening. You think the owners must pity you, but more often they avoided your gaze, as if meeting your eyes might oblige them to remember your name. At the corner, a vendor sells rice porridge ladled from an iron pot that has simmered since dawn. The smell is both comforting and faintly sour, a reminder that even hunger in this district is tinged with something unfinished. You pause, considering whether to buy a bowl. You think you could savour it just this once, just for yourself. But you know the coin you carry is marked in the ledger, each sen accounted for. Even a single indulgence will reappear later as another line you will be made to recite. So you turn away, your stomach tight with the small, familiar ache you have learned to ignore. As you walk further, you pass other women in plain robes, their hair bound simply, their eyes lowered. You think perhaps you share something with them, that you are companions in this moment of near invisibility. But no one nods. No one slows. Even your solitude here must remain separate. At the bridge, you stop and rest your hands on the worn railing. The canal below reflects the last light of the sky, a thin ribbon of tarnished silver. You think the water should feel cleansing, but it smells of silt and dye and all the discarded things the district no longer wanted. Once, you watched a courtesan slip a folded scrap of paper into this current. A prayer, she whispered, though she never said to whom. The current carried it away without ceremony. You think of her sometimes, wondering whether her wish was ever granted. When the temple bell tolls the hour, you know you must return. You turn back, your robe catching on a splinter in the railing. For a moment you let it tug against you, savouring the small resistance. But then you release it. In Yoshiwara, you learned early that nothing ever pulls you free. The first lanterns glow in the alley as you retrace your steps. The plain robe will be folded away. The painted kimono will be fastened at your waist. And when you bow to the clients tonight, no one will know that you stood here, alone, hoping for something simpler. You think the night air might have changed you, but when you cross the threshold, you feel exactly as you did before, only quieter inside. You return to the house just as the last glow slips behind the rooftops. Inside, the air feels different, dense with anticipation, as though the walls themselves are preparing for another night of careful performances. The matron waits by the folding screen, her hands folded in front of her, her expression as calm as a painted scroll. You think she must be stern by nature, but her composure was something she learned long ago, a discipline as finely cultivated as any courtesan's smile. If you were a courtesan newly returned from absence, this was the moment you dreaded most. Not the greeting of clients, not the soft inquiries you would pretend not to hear, but this small interval when the matron would look at you without blinking, measuring all the ways you had changed. You bowed lower than before, because you understood the debt had grown in your absence. And in that silence, you learned again that gratitude was not optional, it was the currency of survival. She asked no questions about your health. She did not mention the ledger, though you both knew it waited in the next room. Instead, she gestured for you to sit. You think this invitation must have felt compassionate, but here, even kindness was strategic. The matron needed you to return to service, to smile, to reassure the clients that nothing was amiss. So she spoke in her measured voice, repeating the lessons you already knew. You must wear the hairpins again, though your neck still felt fragile. You must keep your voice steady when you laughed, though it caught in your throat. You must accept every cup of sake with the same serenity you showed before the child, the confinement, the quiet rearrangement of your body's borders. You think such instructions would feel cruel, but they were simply true. As she spoke, her gaze drifted to the doorway. You realized she had watched countless women sit in this same spot, their hands trembling against the smooth weave of their robes. And in that moment you understood that the matron's authority was built not on punishment but on patience. A patience so complete it had become its own kind of power. When she fell silent, you bowed again. She inclined her head in acknowledgement, a movement so small it might have been imagined. Then she gestured to the attendant waiting behind you. The attendant stepped forward, offering a folded kimono, its color a deep, forgiving indigo. You took it without protest, though you knew it had already been entered in the accounts. When you rose, the matron did not watch you go. Her eyes were fixed on the flickering candle that burned between you, as if it contained every story she would never tell. Outside, the corridors were quiet, the hush of waiting as thick as incense. You slipped back into your chamber, the kimono pressed against your chest, and sat alone for a moment before dressing. You think her instructions were meant to diminish you. But, as you traced the edge of the folded cloth, you felt something else, a hard, unfamiliar certainty that survival was a skill you had finally learned for yourself. The candle sputtered in the draught. You waited until it steadied, until the shadows grew still again, and only then did you begin to dress. You emerge from your chamber as the hour bells sound across Yoshiwara, the deep notes rolling through the alleys like a summons. You think the chime would feel reassuring, a sign that the world was orderly, predictable. But it only reminds you that everything here runs on a schedule you did not choose. At the end of the corridor, the threshold waits. A polished beam of cedar worn smooth by generations of bare feet. You pause there, one hand resting against the frame. If you were a courtesan returning after absence, this was the moment of final rehearsal. Beyond the doorway, the clients waited. Their voices drifted in soft clouds of polite conversation. The scent of incense drifted with them, mingling with the heavier sweetness of sake. You think you could step across as you were, that the simple act of showing yourself would be enough. But you knew it was not. Your robe was folded perfectly. Your hair bound high with combs so heavy they made your neck ache. Your face painted so pale you scarcely recognized your own reflection. It was not for you. It was for them to ensure the illusion remained unbroken. The attendant stood beside you, her hands folded at her waist. She did not speak. She did not need to. The silence between you was filled with everything you both understood, that this threshold was more than a piece of wood. It was the dividing line between private grief and public grace. Once you had crossed it without thinking, but tonight you felt its weight in the hollow of your chest. You think the clients might sense the change in you, but the truth is simpler. They would see only what they wanted to see. A courtesan returned to her place, no different than before. When you finally stepped forward, your foot pressed into the groove worn by countless others. For a heartbeat, you felt the shape of every woman who had paused here, gathering herself to pretend again. The curtain parted as you passed, the fabric brushing your cheek like a cold hand. The light beyond was warm, golden, flattering. You stood in it, breathing. Someone called your name, a name that was never yours but had become the only one you could answer to. You inclined your head, your gaze lowered just enough to be modest but never so much as to look afraid. You think it would feel like submission. But in that moment it felt closer to defiance. An unspoken promise that you would not vanish behind the screen again so easily. As you moved among the tables, the clients raised their cups in greeting. You bowed to each in turn, your heart steady in your chest. Every gesture was deliberate, a choreography you had mastered too well to forget. The matron watched from the far corner, her face unreadable. Perhaps she, too, measured the small differences, the way you moved, the way you did not flinch. When the sake was poured and the first polite laughter began, you felt something shift. Not freedom, never that, but a quiet certainty that whatever happened next, you would meet it with eyes open. Outside, the hour bells finished their tolling. The night resumed its rhythms, and in this house of thresholds and ledgers, you took your place again, as if you had never left. You step outside into the narrow street that winds past the front of the house. The night is warmer now. the air thick with the sweetness of spilled sake and the smoke of pine wood braziers. You think the lanterns hanging from the eaves would feel like beacons guiding you home. But here, they are more like patient witnesses watching everything, remembering nothing. If you were a courtesan, you would have walked this street 100 times. Each evening, your form hidden beneath layers of brocade, your face composed in the gentle smile that promised your heart was still unclaimed. But some nights you stepped into the darkness in a plain robe, your hair unadorned, your hands folded carefully to hide the way they trembled. The lanterns were always there, their thin paper walls painted with the crest of the house, their light steady as a heartbeat. You think it would have felt comforting to be seen by something so constant. But in Yoshiwara, being seen was never the same as being known. The clients arrived by litter, their footsteps muffled by the woven mats, laid to protect their sandals from the mud. You watched them emerge, some laughing, some already drunk, some carrying gifts they had purchased out of obligation rather than affection. If they glanced at you, it was with the bland curiosity a man reserves for a familiar decoration. You think this would have felt humiliating, but after enough seasons, indifference became almost a relief. There was a time, years earlier, when you had believed that being chosen meant something, that a man's fondness might one day become protection, that your debt might vanish beneath the soft weight of gratitude. But the lanterns had watched too many bargains made and broken to believe in such illusions. On the evenings when your absence could no longer be hidden, when the pregnancy pressed against your sash with the quiet insistence of its own reality, you learned to lower your eyes and measure each step. The matron had taught you that movement could disguise almost anything if performed with care. You think that discipline must have felt empowering. And sometimes it did, but more often it felt like a gentle betrayal of the self you once imagined you would remain. Tonight you pause beneath the largest lantern, the one closest to the entrance. The thin paper is patched in places where past seasons have burned small holes. You trace the edge of one charred scar with your fingertip, feeling the brittle texture of something that endured without complaint. In that moment, you understand why the lanterns felt so familiar. Like you, they had been shaped to shine brightly, even as the heat hollowed them from the inside. The hour bell tolls in the distance, a soft percussion that signals the start of the night's business. You turn back toward the entrance, gathering the folds of your robe in one hand. You think you will remember this pause, that some part of it will remain when all the debts are paid and all ledgers are closed. But you also know that memory is as fragile as paper, and just as easily consumed by flame. As you cross the threshold once more, the lantern sways behind you, its glow steady, indifferent, and impossibly patient. You slip back into the house, careful to let the door close without a sound. The corridor is narrow here, the lamps hung low so the shadows pool at your feet. You think the hush might feel soothing like the calm before a welcome sleep. But in Yoshiwara, quiet was never the same as rest. If you were a courtesan, you would have learned the small rituals of staying invisible. When the body betrayed you with its secret growth, your survival depended on the performance of normalcy so perfect it could not be questioned. The first ritual was posture. The matron taught you to hold your shoulders level and your back straight, to let the long sleeves of your kimono drape just so. When you sat, you kept your hands folded across your lap, a single gesture that concealed more than any curtain ever could. You think it must have felt exhausting to maintain this posture, hour after hour, and it did. But the alternative discovery was a price too steep to risk. The second ritual was laughter. A courtesan was never permitted to appear troubled. No matter what she carried hidden, she must smile with the same soft composure. You practiced it each evening in the polished copper mirror, measuring the tilt of your head, the curve of your lips. You imagined this constant rehearsal would hollow you out, and perhaps it did. But the hollowness was useful. It made space for the discipline you needed to survive. The third ritual was silence. In the dressing chamber, you said nothing of your absence. You did not ask questions about who had replaced you at the banquets, who had claimed your favourite comb. You did not mention the ledger, though you knew the sums it recorded had grown heavier. You think such restraint would feel like surrender, but in time it began to feel like something else, a quiet refusal to allow the house to own your thoughts as well as your body. On the nights when the pain was worse, when your sash pressed too tightly against your belly and your breath came shallow, you closed your eyes and imagined the face of your child. Even if you would never see them again, you kept the shape of them alive in your memory. This, too, was a ritual. And though no one spoke of it, you knew the other women performed the same small acts. You saw it in the way they touched the folds of their sleeves, in the way their voices gentled when the hour grew late. In this place, survival was never about grand declarations. It was made of these quiet habits: posture, laughter, silence repeated until they became indistinguishable from the self you presented to the world. You stepped back into the main hall, the hush breaking just enough to admit the sound of a shamisen drifting from the far side of the partition. The melody is slow and almost sweet, though you know it was composed for a play about loss. You think the song might be too melancholy to bear. But as you move past the threshold, you feel something like relief. Here, at least sorrow was allowed to speak its name, if only in music. You bow to the matron as you pass, her face half lit by the wavering lamp. She inclines her head, no more than a fraction. Between you, nothing is said. Everything is understood. You enter the accounting room, the door sliding closed behind you with a hush that feels almost respectful. You think this space might feel neutral, a place for records, nothing more. But here, the ledgers were alive, and their presence was more tyrant than servant. If you were a courtesan, you would have stood here many times before. Each visit the same ritual, a bow, a silence, the soft rustle of paper, as the matron turned to the page where your name was written. The ledger rested on a lacquered stand no higher than your waist. The ink was black as regret, each column ruled with a precision that left no room for mercy. You think it must have been the numbers themselves that hurt the most, but it was the calm in which they were read that carved the memory deepest. Training fees, garment maintenance, absence 6 weeks, herbal requisitions. The words were always spoken without judgment. That, somehow, made them heavier. Sometimes you imagined what it would feel like to run your hand across the page and smear the ink, to erase the sum with the warmth of your palm. But even in your quietest moments you never dared. You think the matron pitied you, but if she did, she never revealed it. Pity was too dangerous here, a softness that might unravel the fragile threads of obedience she had spent decades weaving. Instead, she waited as you listened, her expression composed, her brush poised to write the acknowledgement that you had heard. When the reading ended, you bowed again. Your mouth formed the words you had been taught since you were old enough to understand. I am grateful. You think this phrase must have been a lie, and in one sense it was. But it was also a kind of shield and agreement to pretend that gratitude was possible, so that something harder would not have to be named. Once, in the first year you came to the house, you had asked the matron when debt was truly paid. She did not answer. She only closed the ledger with a softness that felt more final than any dismissal. Years later, you stopped asking. You learned instead to study the pages with the same blank composure she did, to meet the sum without flinching, to feel its weight without letting it anchor you completely. When you left the room, the ledger remained behind. Its pages did not tremble. Its ink did not fade. You think this permanence would feel reassuring, but it was more like standing beside a well whose depth you could never measure. Tonight, as you step into the corridor again, you feel the quiet insistence of the ledger pressing against your back, like a hand you cannot shrug off. You pass a table where the lamps have burned low. The shadows lean across the floor, blurring the edges of the tatami. You think you could lose yourself in this darkness just for a moment, just long enough to forget. But when you look up, the matron is watching from the far end of the hall, her silhouette framed by the faint glow of a single lantern. You bow, because there is nothing else to do. And when you straighten, you carry the ledger with you, not in your hands, but in the slow, measured beat of your heart. You step into the receiving room, where the incense has already been lit. The smoke drifts in pale threads across the low ceiling, carrying the sharp sweetness of sandalwood. You think the fragrance would feel cleansing, like a promise that the night could be made pure again. But here, it was simply another veil drawn over truths no one wished to name. If you were a courtesan, you would have learned to breathe this smoke without coughing, to let it cling to your robe and your hair until its sweetness was as familiar as your own skin. The clients believed the scent made everything more refined, more sacred, even. You watched them close their eyes as they inhaled, their faces softening in the illusion that the air itself was forgiving. But you knew what the incense really was, a polite camouflage. It disguised the smells no one wished to acknowledge, the sour trace of old sake, the iron tang of blood, the salt of fear rising from your skin when the questions grew too close. You think that knowledge would have made you resent it, but in time, you found a strange gratitude for the cover it offered. Better to be hidden by sandalwood than laid bare before so many eyes. Each evening, the matron selected a new stick from a lacquered box. She never explained why she chose one scent over another. You came to believe there was no reason, or perhaps too many reasons to name. Some women said she lit the incense for the clients, to soothe them into spending freely. Others whispered it was for the women themselves, a small mercy to soften the edge of endurance. You never asked. You only learned to watch the smoke and measure your breathing by the rate it drifted toward the rafters. Once you noticed a client watching you as you replenished the censer. He asked if the scent reminded you of home. You think you could have laughed at the absurdity home was a word you had stopped believing in. But instead, you smiled and told him it did, because that was what he wanted to hear. When he left, the room smelled richer than before, thick with the mingled fragrances of the evening. You waited until the door slid shut, then let your shoulders fall by a fraction. In the quiet, you imagined how many nights had ended this way, smoke curling into the darkness, the last threads of sweetness trailing after the departing guests. You think the incense would eventually fade, that it would leave the air clean again. But the truth is, it never really left. It sank into the grain of the wood, the weave of the tatami, the folds of every robe you wore. Even when you slipped outside into the alley, the fragrance followed you, as if to remind you that no step could be taken without the house claiming a part of you. Tonight, as you bank the last coals in the brazier, you catch the faintest breath of burned sandalwood rising from your sleeve. You think you could shake it free, but you do not try. Some things are better left clinging, if only because their presence is easier than the emptiness they cover. You kneel in the quietest corner of the receiving room, your hands folded neatly in your lap. You think the hush would feel like a reprieve, an interval in which no one expects anything from you. But here, even silence was a performance. If you were a courtesan, you would know that your name was not yours. It had been given to you when you first arrived, a name chosen for its elegance, its suggestion of fleeting beauty. They called you Asago, morning glory, or Yuga, evening face. A name that belonged to the house as surely as the lacquered screens and the ledgers. You think such a name would feel like an honor, but over time it became another debt, a fragile mask you were obliged to hold in place. When a client asked your name, you spoke it in a voice as smooth as the tea you poured. You watched his expression soften, as if he believed that name meant he knew you. Sometimes, in the earliest hours of morning, you whispered it to yourself in the dark, testing whether it still fit, whether it ever had. You think this small ritual would feel ridiculous, but it was one of the few ways you could remind yourself that behind the borrowed syllables, there was still a person you might one day recover. Once, an older courtesan told you that names were like kimono, beautiful but temporary. She said hers had been changed 3 times. Each time she returned from confinement, she was given a new name to signal her rebirth to the clients, a polite fiction that the woman who came back was fresh, untouched by whatever had driven her into seclusion. You think that would have felt like erasure, and it did, but it also offered a peculiar relief. If everything was only pretense, then nothing had to be mourned. When the matron read your name aloud during the accounting, she never looked at you. She looked at the page, as though the voice speaking belonged to the ledger itself. In those moments, you felt yourself shrink into the smallness of that name, a shape you had to wear even when it chafed against the memory of who you were before. Tonight, as you pour the first cup of sake, a client asks if your name was given to you by your mother. You think you could explain the truth that your real name was hidden, that it had been written on a slip of paper, folded into the contract you signed before you were old enough to understand what it meant. But you smile instead, because the story he wants is softer. You say, yes, it was your mother's gift. You say it as if it were a memory you cherished. He seems satisfied with this lie. The evening continues. When the door finally closes behind him, you sit alone for a moment longer, your hand resting lightly on the rim of the sake cup. You think you could leave your name behind with the empty dishes, that you could stand and walk away unnamed. But when you rise, you hear the matron's voice in the next room, calling you by the name that has been entered in the ledger, stitched onto your kimono, whispered in the corridors. And so you answer, because in Yoshiwara, you are never only yourself. You are the name they paid to own. You return to the dressing chamber when the last client has gone, the hush of the hour settling over the house like a thin layer of ash. You think this quiet would feel peaceful, but it is only the absence of voices, a space where everything you have concealed lingers in the air, waiting to be acknowledged. If you were a courtesan, this was the time when you were allowed to unpin your hair. Your attendant waits behind you, her movements unhurried as she lifts the first comb from the elaborate knot. The lacquered teeth slide free with a whisper that feels almost intimate. You think the relief would be immediate, but the weight of the comb leaves behind a phantom pressure, a reminder of all the hours you balanced it on your skull without letting it slip. One by one, the ornaments are removed, carved tortoise-shell, slivers of gold, tiny bells that chimed when you turned your head. Each piece set carefully on a folded cloth, each one counted. You think this inventory would feel tedious, but it was a ritual that proved you had survived another evening. Once, you asked an older courtesan why the combs were so heavy. She smiled, a little sadly, and told you that beauty must always cost something. Otherwise, it would be mistaken for freedom. You never forgot those words. When the last hairpin is set aside, your attendant unwinds the coil of your hair. It falls over your shoulders, warm and heavy, smelling faintly of camellia oil. For a moment, you almost recognize the girl you were before all this began. You think she must be gone entirely. But in that moment, she feels close enough to touch. Then the attendant brushes your hair, slow, even strokes that ease some of the ache from your scalp. You close your eyes, allowing yourself a single breath of softness. In this house, tenderness was always borrowed, but sometimes it was enough to carry you to morning. You watch the combs laid out in a neat line, shining evidence of the roles you have played. Each one has a name you are expected to remember. Each one has a cost you are expected to repay. Outside the dressing chamber, the matron passes by, her steps muffled against the tatami. She does not look in. This moment is not part of the performance. It is yours alone, for as long as it lasts. When the brushing is done, you gather your hair in your hands, feeling its weight like a question you cannot answer. You think you could leave it unbound just once, as a quiet act of refusal. But as the lamps burn lower, you begin to coil it again. Some gestures are so practiced they no longer feel like surrender. They feel like survival. You tie the final length in place and fold the robe tighter around your body. The combs glint in the lamplight, patient as always. You think their brightness would feel accusing, but they are only objects demanding nothing, offering nothing, waiting to be worn again. When you step into the corridor, the hush follows you like a second skin, and somewhere in the darkness, you feel the phantom weight of the comb resting against your crown. Even now, you return to the receiving room in the pale hush before dawn, when even the lanterns seem too tired to glow. You think this hour might be merciful, that the world would grant you a moment without expectation. But in Yoshiwara, there were no unguarded moments. The ledger waited, always. If you were a courtesan, you would recognize the screen in the corner, the one painted with cranes and pines in delicate, untroubled strokes. A screen meant to suggest serenity, to distract the eye from the truth it concealed. Behind it, the ledger rested on a low stand. The ink pot beside it was never dry. The brush lay ready, its bristles stained from years of tallies no one would ever read aloud. You think the ledger would feel impersonal, the inevitable bureaucracy of a business. But it was more intimate than any caress. It knew every detail you tried to forget. When the matron arrived, she did not ask how you had slept. She did not ask if you were well. She slid the screen aside with the same quiet composure she brought to every task, and she sat with the ledger open between you. Your name, the name the house had given you, was written at the top of the page. Below it, the neat columns weighted expenses, advances, deductions. 6 nights in absence, she murmured, her voice so soft it almost sounded compassionate. 1 new robe, 1 replacement sash, additional incense, additional rice. You think you could protest, explain that you had needed these things, that you had never asked to vanish behind the sliding screen. But no one asked you to explain, only to acknowledge. So you bowed because there was no other answer. She dipped the brush into the ink and recorded your assent. A single character to mark that you had heard, that you had accepted. You watched the bristles drag across the rice paper, laying down a line that felt heavier than any robe you wore. Once, early in your apprenticeship, you asked the matron if the ledger ever closed if there was a day when the debts ended and you were free to walk away. She had looked up then, her eyes meeting yours for the briefest heartbeat. No, she said, not unless someone pays. You never asked again. When she finished writing, she set the brush aside and folded her hands over the ledger's spine. For a moment you thought she might speak some kindness, some reassurance. But she only inclined her head, granting you permission to leave. You stood slowly, your legs unsteady from the long night. As you turned to go, you felt the ledger's presence pressed against your back, like a hand that would never lift. Outside the room, the corridors were grey with the first light of morning. You think the dawn would feel like a promise, that it would offer you a small beginning. But it only revealed everything that had been hidden in the dark. As you walked away, you caught the faint smell of sandalwood rising from the folds of your robe, a reminder that even when you tried to step outside the story, it followed. You paused at the threshold, your hand resting on the doorframe, and listened for the sound of the matron sliding the screen closed again. When it came, it was soft as a sigh, but to you it sounded final. You step into the small storeroom behind the kitchen, where the air is thick with the smell of dried herbs and old cedar. You think this room might feel anonymous, a place no one noticed or remembered. But here, the walls held the stories that were never written down. If you were a courtesan, you would have stood here on more than one evening, your robe folded carefully over your arms as you waited for the midwife. There was no official record of these visits, no column in the ledger to note them, but everyone knew they happened. The midwife arrived without announcement, her steps soft on the boards. She carried a bundle of cloth tied with twine, her tools hidden in its folds. You think she might have looked sorrowful, but her face was as steady as always. Sorrow was too costly to display. When she set the bundle on the low table, you felt the hush deepen. The air itself seemed to contract, bracing for what was to come. She prepared the tincture without a word. Mugwort, safflower, a shred of bitter bark. A combination older than the house itself. You think such rituals would feel sinister, but they did not. They were simply necessary. You watched her pour the mixture into a shallow cup. She turned it in her hands, as though measuring the weight of its consequences. Then she looked up, her eyes meeting yours with a calm that felt like permission. You think that look would have comforted you. And sometimes it did, but more often, it only reminded you how alone you were in the choosing. In this place, there were debts recorded in ink, and others written only in the quiet of this room, debts measured in the hush of held breath, the tremor in your hands as you lifted the cup to your lips. No one would ask if you had swallowed it willingly. No one would write it down, but you would carry the memory in your body, in the knowledge that even this choice was not quite yours. Afterward, the midwife rinsed the cup and set it aside. She wrapped her bundle again, her movements unhurried, as though this moment was only one of many. And it was. You think she might have spoken then, offered some small absolution, but she only inclined her head, a gesture that felt almost like respect. When she was gone, you stayed a little longer, your hands folded over your belly. You thought you might feel emptiness, but there was only a dull clarity, the recognition that the silence here was as binding as any written account. You rose and slipped back into the corridor. The lamps had burned low, their light a thin lattice against the floorboards. You think you could leave this moment behind when the sun rose, but you knew better. Some ledgers were never closed because they were never acknowledged. Outside, a rooster called into the darkness, as if to summon the day before you were ready. You paused in the doorway, the smell of mugwort still clinging to your sleeves. You think the dawn might cleanse you of it, but even as you stepped into the brighter hall, you felt the memory settle into your bones, as enduring as any debt you had ever signed your name beneath. You slipped back through the narrow side door, your feet bare against the cool wood of the corridor. You think the hush that follows you would feel merciful, like a pause granted for endurance. But here, quiet was simply another obligation. If you were a courtesan, you would know these hours well, the hours between the lamps being extinguished and the first stirring of the kitchen. A time when no one called your name, when no ledgers were read aloud. But even in this hush, you were never truly unobserved. The matron sometimes walked the corridors before dawn. You heard the faint shuffle of her steps, the sigh of her robes brushing the door frames. She never knocked, never asked questions. She only paused, listening for the small sounds that betrayed which women had yet to sleep. You think this vigilance must have felt cruel, but in Yoshiwara, it was considered kindness to notice without confronting, to allow you the dignity of pretending you were at peace. In your chamber, the brazier had burned low. The last cinders glowed like hidden embers in the darkness. You folded your robe carefully and placed it beside the pillow. Once, you thought that removing the outer kimono would leave you lighter, but you discovered that some weights did not rest in cloth. You think you could drift to sleep as you were, your hair still braided, the last taste of mugwort still bitter on your tongue, but your body refused to surrender. So you sat for a while with your back against the wall, watching the darkness settle around you. The hush here was thick enough to press against your skin. You felt it in your throat, a tightness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the knowledge that this quiet would end soon. Some nights you reached for the small wooden comb hidden under your pillow. You would turn it over in your hands, remembering the girl who brought it with her when she first crossed the threshold. You think she would not recognize you now, and perhaps you would not recognize her either. When you finally lay down, you pulled the thin quilt up to your chin. You thought the warmth might ease the ache on your bones, that it would soften the memory of the ledger, the screen, the silent cup, but the warmth was shallow. You felt it hover at the surface of your skin without ever sinking deeper. Outside the shutters, the wind stirred the paper lanterns. The faint creak of their cords reached you like a reminder that the house never truly slept. You closed your eyes and tried to imagine the street beyond the gate, how it looked when you were too young to know what waited here. But the image blurred before you could catch it. You think memory would comfort you, but tonight it felt like a luxury you could not afford. When you finally slept, it was the thin, uneasy rest of someone who knows the lamps will be lit again too soon. You open your eyes to the grey of dawn pressing against the shutters. You think for a moment that you have overslept, that the house has already woken without you, but the hush remains, as though time itself has paused to grant you one more moment before the performance begins again. If you were a courtesan, you would know this hour too well. The hour when the lamps were rekindled and every gesture had to be made again from the beginning. You sit slowly, the quilt slipping from your shoulders in a soft collapse. Your robe is still folded at your side, the hair comb resting on top of it. You touch it without thinking, feeling the smoothness of the lacquer worn thin, where your thumb has traced it 100 times. You think the comb would feel like an anchor, something that could tether you to the self you used to be. But it is only a small artifact, neither comfort nor burden, just proof that you have not yet disappeared. The matron steps past your door. You listen for a moment, waiting to hear if she will pause. But today she moves on, her attention claimed by other ledgers, other women. You rise and dress in silence, binding your hair in the practiced coils that have become as familiar as your own breath. The weight of the comb returns to your crown, and with it, the invisible mask you must wear. You think the act of preparing yourself would grow easier over time, but it never does. Each morning feels like the first, the moment when you step into the costume of someone who must be untroubled, unassailable, perfectly composed. When you leave your chamber, the lamps have already been lit. Their glow pools in shallow circles along the hall, warm against the cold morning air. You walk past them without slowing, feeling the hush shift around you, the way a hand moves across water. In the receiving room, the braziers have been stirred back to life. The scent of sandalwood curls into the spaces between the tatami, blending with the faint bitterness of yesterday's sake. You pause at the threshold, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe. You think you could turn back, just this once, that you could return to your chamber and close the door against the ledger, the names, the obligations that wait beyond the curtain. But you do not. Instead, you step forward, the lamps brightening as you pass beneath them. You bow to the matron, to the attendants, to the quiet audience of empty seats. Some part of you wonders what it would feel like to enter this room without the comb, without the robe, without the name that has become your only currency. You think it might feel like relief, but perhaps it would only feel like vanishing. When you lift your head, the matron nods once, acknowledging that you are ready to begin again. No one speaks of what came before, what you carried in the night. In Yoshiwara, the morning was not a new beginning. It was simply the continuation of the story everyone had agreed to tell. And as you move to pour the first cup of tea, you feel the weight of your hair, the smooth edge of the comb, the hush of the dawn that has already slipped away. You step outside just as the first pale band of daylight spills over the tiled rooftops. You think the dawn would feel like a question, some silent invitation to start over. But here, morning was simply another backdrop against which you rehearsed the same quiet survival. If you were a courtesan, you would have learned that the dawn was neither friend nor witness. It was only the hour when debts became visible again, when the hush of night gave way to the counting of coins and the recitation of names. You walk along the narrow path that runs behind the house. The shutters are still closed, the lamps extinguished. The street is empty, but you feel its familiarity pressing in around you like a hand on your shoulder. You pause by the water basin, its rim chipped where countless hands have rested. You think the water would feel cool and cleansing, but when you dip your fingers in, it is already warm from the memory of so many dawns. You close your eyes, trying to recall a morning when you woke without dread, but the memory will not come. Somewhere behind you, a shutter opens. You hear the matron's voice, low and steady, speaking to the attendant who records each delivery, sacks of rice, bolts of cotton, casks of oil. You know that when you step back inside, your own tally will be waiting. You think you could stay here a little longer, that the morning air might loosen the tightness in your throat. But every moment you linger will become another line in the ledger, another debt to be spoken aloud. So you dry your hands on your sleeve and turn back to the door. When you step inside, the hall feels dimmer than the street you left. The shadows that clung to you in the night seem to have followed you here, drawn to the places the lanterns cannot touch. You think the matron will look at you, that she will read something in your face, but she does not look up from her papers. She only lifts one hand in a gesture that means you are to wait. You lower your eyes and bow, because this is the only reply that will not cost you more. In the hush, you notice the details no one else remarks upon. The faint ring of tea at the edge of the ledger's cover, the way the ink has pooled in one corner of the matron's brush pot. These small imperfections feel almost daring, proof that even here, nothing was as immaculate as it pretended to be. You think you could take comfort in that, but comfort has become something you no longer expect. When the matron finally lifts her head, her expression is as unreadable as always. She inclines her chin, a signal that you may go and prepare yourself. You bow again and step back into the corridor. The dawn follows you like an obedient servant, bright enough to show you everything, too indifferent to care. You think you could outrun it, but you already know better. You slip into the dressing chamber, the hush of the hour still wrapped around you like an unasked question. You think the quiet would feel restful, but here it only means there is no one to distract you from yourself. If you were a courtesan, this was when you chose your robe for the day, not the bright brocade reserved for evening, but the softer layers meant to suggest that nothing had ever gone wrong. The attendant waits by the cedar chest, her hands resting lightly on the lacquered lid. She does not speak. She knows that this choice is yours alone. You kneel and slide the lid aside. The smell of old silk rises around you, faintly sweet, faintly sour, like a memory you can't quite place. You think you could select any robe, but your hand always drifts to the same one, the pale indigo with the subtle wisteria pattern. It was the first robe you wore when you returned from the hidden room after your confinement. The first time you learned that a garment could hold the memory of what you would never say aloud. You lift it carefully, feeling the weight of the folded fabric settle across your palms. It is lighter than the evening robes, but somehow it feels heavier. You think you could choose differently, that a fresh robe would mean a fresh story. But even as you think it, your hands are already smoothing the familiar creases. The attendant steps forward and helps you drape the robe across your shoulders. Her touch is gentle, practiced just enough to steady you without seeming to. For a moment you close your eyes. You imagine how you must look from the outside, composed, serene, untouched by all the quiet reckonings this robe has witnessed. You think that imagining would bring you shame, but it only brings you a strange, detached pity for the woman you pretend to be and the woman you still are underneath. When you open your eyes, the robe has settled into place. The wisteria flowers curve across your chest, their shapes as precise as the debts they symbolize. Once, you overheard a client admiring this pattern. He said it reminded him of early summer, of evenings when the world smelled of warm rain and new blossoms. You smiled as you poured his tea, though the memory the robe carried for you was nothing so gentle. You think you could have told him, that you could have said the robe was chosen because it was plain enough to hide the trembling of your hands. But you didn't. Some truths were too small to change anything, and some were too large to be spoken aloud. You turn toward the mirror propped against the wall. The reflection that looks back is so familiar you almost believe in it. The soft fall of the robe, the precise line of your hair, the eyes that never quite meet your own. You think you could learn to love this version of yourself, but love feels too indulgent. Endurance will have to be enough. When the matron calls your name from the hallway, you incline your head. The robe moves with you, graceful as always, and as you step across the threshold, you feel the weight of its history settle against your second story you carry whether you choose to or not. You sit in the receiving room, the pale indigo robe folded perfectly over your knees. You think the morning would feel lighter than the evenings, the clients gentler, the demands softer. But here, nothing was ever truly simple. If you were a courtesan, you would have known that the first cup of tea was never only a cup of tea. The matron places the tray before you, her expression unchanged. The small porcelain pot, the 2 cups, the folded cloth laid precisely across the lacquered surface. A ritual so exact it feels almost holy. You think this ceremony must have felt comforting, an anchor in a life where everything shifted. But you learned quickly that every gesture was layered with expectation. You pour the tea with both hands, the sleeves of your robe falling in a perfect drape. The steam rises, carrying the faint bitterness of roasted leaves. You think the warmth would feel reassuring against your skin, but it only reminds you that you are still here, still performing. The client watching you is quiet. His gaze never lifts from your hands. You wonder what he sees: a woman he admires, a story he has purchased for an hour, or simply another debt to be tallied. You think you could ask him, that you could break the script just once. But even as you imagine it, you are lifting the cup to offer him the first sip. He accepts it without a word. You lower your gaze, careful to reveal nothing. This was the skill you were trained to perfect, the art of offering something that felt intimate while keeping the truth hidden. Once, another courtesan told you that every cup of tea was an unspoken contract, a promise that the illusion would hold as long as you both needed it too. You think the idea sounds cynical, but as you refill his cup, you realize it is only accurate. When he speaks, his voice is softer than you expect. He asks if you are well. You answer with the same quiet phrase you have spoken to 100 men. I am content. You think the lie would grow easier, but each time you say it, it feels as if you are stepping a little further away from the girl who once believed in simpler truths. The tea cools as the conversation drifts. You nod where you are expected to, laugh in the places he leaves open for your laughter. It feels almost like memory, like something you have done so often it no longer requires thought. But underneath the practiced responses, you feel the ache of something unspoken. Not resentment, exactly. Not sorrow. Only the small, constant recognition that your life here was measured in these moments, cups poured, smiles given, hours endured. When he finally stands to leave, you bow low enough that your forehead nearly touches the mat. The matron steps forward to escort him out, her steps precise, her silence as fluent as yours. You remain kneeling, your hands resting lightly on the tray. You think you could rise now, return to your chamber, let the morning pass without further pretense. But you know the next client will be here soon. And so you lift the teapot again, feeling its delicate weight settle into your palm. In Yoshiwara, there was never a moment that belonged only to you. Even the tea remembered its purpose. You return to your chamber when the last client has departed, the morning lights slanting across the tatami in thin, bright bands. You think the empty room would feel like yours again, a space that might let you rest. But here, emptiness was only another kind of performance. If you were a courtesan, you would have learned that there was no such thing as being unobserved. Even alone, you carried the memory of every gaze, every expectation. You kneel by the low chest where your personal things are kept. A small mirror, a comb, a folded scrap of fabric you have not touched in months. You think you could leave it there, pretend you no longer remember what it once meant, but your hand hovers over it anyway. Once, the scrap was part of a child's swaddling cloth. The midwife had tucked it into your sleeve on the morning you returned from the hidden room. She said nothing. She never did. But her hands were steady, her eyes the only place you ever saw an unguarded sorrow. You think you should have thrown it away. That holding onto it was an indulgence you could not afford. But some part of you needed proof that the child had existed, that you had been more than a body rented by the hour. When you finally set the cloth aside, your hand trembles. You pull it back into your lap and press your palm flat against your thigh until the shaking stops. The matron's voice calls your name from the corridor. You think she must know what you are doing, that she can sense every private act. But when you open the door, her face is as calm as always. "Another guest," she says. Just those words. Nothing more. You bow, because it is the only answer you have ever been allowed to give. In the mirror, you catch a glimpse of your reflection as you stand. The pale indigo robe, the hair coiled perfectly, the face composed in the same measured serenity you have practiced for years. You think you could step away from this reflection, that you could choose to leave the mask behind. But the mask is not something you wear. It is something you have become. The matron turns to lead you down the hall. You walk behind her in silence, feeling the hidden weight of the cloth you left in the chest. At the entrance, you pause for a breath you will not let anyone see. The air smells of sandalwood and old tea, the same scent that has soaked into the beams in your memory alike. You think you could forget, if you tried hard enough. That if you poured enough cups, if you bowed often enough, the past would finally release you. But as you kneel to greet the new client, you know it will not. The mask settles into place again, smooth and familiar. A face that never flinches, never reveals, never asks. And as the client smiles, you hear yourself offering the same practiced greeting, the same borrowed name. In Yoshiwara, you were never allowed to be unfinished. You were always expected to be complete, polished, whole, even when nothing inside you felt whole at all. You rise from the tatami as the client departs, the quiet closing of the sliding door ringing louder in your ears than any voice. You think the emptiness he leaves behind would feel clean, but it only settles into the room like another layer of residue. If you were a courtesan, you would have known that the air itself held the memory of every transaction. You cross to the brazier, where the incense has nearly burned away. A thin curl of smoke drifts upward, carrying the last trace of sandalwood and something darker underneath. You think it might be sorrow, but in this place, sorrow and survival smell almost the same. When you kneel to bank the coals, the sleeve of your robe brushes the lacquered tray. The scent rises again, faint, persistent, inescapable. Once you asked another woman if the smell ever faded. She looked at you with the weary affection of someone older and said, "No." It stays in your hair, even when you leave. You think she meant it as a warning. But part of you took it as a promise, proof that no matter how carefully the house tried to polish you into forgetfulness, something would remain. The matron enters without knocking. She does not glance at the incense or the tray. She only lifts the ledger in her hands, the binding worn soft where her thumb rests. 2 guests this morning, she says. Her voice is neutral, so carefully uninflected that you could almost pretend she is reciting weather reports. You bow. You wait for her to speak the numbers. She does not. Instead, she gestures toward the dressing room, where another robe waits of brighter pattern, something meant to signal that you are ready for evening guests. You think you could protest, that you could ask for another hour to let your bones remember how to stand without effort. But you know better. When she leaves, you rise slowly. The robe you wear slips against your skin, damp from the heat of the brazier and the weight of hours spent kneeling. In the dressing room, you strip away the indigo fabric, folding it along the same creases you have traced so many times. The new robe is heavier, the silk stiff with the scent of camphor, and the faint ghost of every woman who wore it before you. You think donning it would feel like renewal, but it feels more like surrender. When the attendant knots the sash at your waist, you feel the familiar tightness return part garment, part memory. You look once into the mirror, though you already know what you will see. A face arranged with perfect serenity, a body trained to endure, and eyes that will not look too closely into their own reflection. You think you could wash away the scent, that with enough hot water, enough soap, enough will, you could strip it from your hair, your skin, your breath, but you do not try. The fragrance follows you into the hall, as it always does. A reminder that no matter how many times you changed your robe or your name or your story, something always remained behind. And as you step into the receiving room once more, you feel it settle around you, a familiar inheritance you never chose, never asked for, but could never quite refuse. You stand in the doorway of the receiving room, your robe gathered carefully in one hand. The afternoon light has grown thick and yellow, the kind that makes every surface look more forgiving than it really is. You think it might soften the edges of the day, but it only makes the shadows look deeper. If you were a courtesan, you would know this was the hour when clients came not for pleasure, but for reassurance, the illusion that their names mattered, that their patronage was something more than an arrangement. You step forward and kneel by the lacquered tray. The matron has left the ledger closed, perhaps as a small courtesy, or perhaps because the sums recorded there are so familiar they no longer require attention. The client sits across from you, his robe scented faintly of old cedar and vinegar. He says nothing at first, only watches as you pour the tea. You think the silence might feel expectant, but it feels complete, like a seal pressed over everything neither of you intends to say. When he finally speaks, it is to ask the same questions every man eventually asks. Are you content? You think you could answer honestly, that you could tell him contentment is something you no longer measure, that every hour has become too similar to distinguish. But you only incline your head because any other answer would be a kind of rebellion you cannot afford. He studies your face as though he might glimpse some private confession there. You lower your gaze to the teacup. Once, in your first season, you tried to answer such questions truthfully. You learned quickly that truth was not the currency traded here, only the shapes of words, polished until they no longer cut. You think this should have felt like a loss, but in time, you discovered it was something simpler, a form of survival as necessary as breathing. The client says something about your beauty. You thank him in the soft, measured tone you have practiced for years. The compliment slides across your skin without catching. When he leaves, he does not look back. The door closes with the same unremarkable hush as every other. You remain kneeling, your hands resting on the edge of the tray. The quiet feels different now, not expectant or final, but like a question that has given up waiting for an answer. You think you could rise immediately, but you stay there a little longer, because in this position you are not expected to smile or pour or reassure. You are allowed, for the span of a few heartbeats, to simply be. In the hallway, you hear the matron's steps approaching. You think she might ask if the client was satisfied, but she does not. When she passes the doorway, she pauses just long enough to meet your gaze. Nothing in her face moves. No question. No judgment. Only the shared knowledge that silence has always been the easiest answer. You bow your head again, not because you owe her gratitude, but because this is the language you both understand. Outside, The light has shifted to the dull gold of late afternoon. You think it might feel like a relief, the day finally nearing its end. But you know better. In Yoshiwara there was no ending. Only the turning of the lamps and the soft closing of the door, again and again, until you forgot you ever expected anything else. You step into the corridor as the last rays of daylight slip behind the rooftops. The attendants move quietly past you, their arms full of fresh candles and folded screens. You think the coming darkness would feel restful a chance to vanish for a little while. But in Yoshiwara, night was never an ending. It was only the prelude to more hours you did not choose. If you were a courtesan, you would know this hour by the hush that settles just before the lamps are lit. A hush that holds the unspoken agreement between the house and the women who live inside it. You will look luminous, no matter what you feel. The attendant stops beside you, offering a small box lacquered black and red. Inside are the implements that will make you ready again. The comb for your hair, the powder for your face, the stick of rouge to stain your mouth a shade that promises warmth you do not feel. You think you could refuse, that you could keep your skin bare and your mouth unpainted. But you know that would be the only kind of shame the house will not tolerate, the shame of failing to pretend. When you sit, the mirror is propped before you, polished so brightly that it shows every detail you wish would remain hidden. The faint hollows at your temples, the small furrow between your brows, the way your eyes never quite match the softness of your smile. You think you could look away. But the mirror demands your attention, as if to remind you that the transformation is the only reason you are permitted to stay. The attendant lifts your hair, smoothing it into the same perfect coils you have worn every night for years. You close your eyes as she pins it, letting the weight of it settle over your scalp like a question you cannot answer. Once, you thought the lamps were lit for you to show you at your best, to give you a glow you could borrow, but now you know better. The lamps are lit for them. For the men who will cross the threshold tonight, carrying stories they will never tell you. For the ones who will forget your face by morning. For the ones who will remember only the way you bowed, the way you poured the tea, the way you smiled when you said you were content. You think that knowledge would have hardened you, but instead, it has made you softer in ways you cannot always forgive. When the attendant sets the rouge to your lips, you keep your eyes on the mirror. You watch the colour bloom against your skin like something alive. You think it should feel like a disguise, but it feels more like a surrender you have practiced so long it no longer feels like giving in. The first lamp flares to life behind you. Its glow spills across your reflection, gilding the edges of your hair, your cheek, the silk folded across your shoulders. In that moment, you look almost beautiful, even to yourself. You think you could believe in this illusion, just for tonight. But when you look more closely, you see the truth waiting beneath the powder, patient as ever. The matron passes the doorway, pausing just long enough to be certain you are ready. You incline your head, the gesture so automatic you barely feel it. The lamplight pools across the floor in a soft, unbroken line. You rise and step over it, your robe trailing behind you like the last shadow of the person you meant to be. You enter the receiving room again, the lamps bright and unflinching. You think you could grow used to this glow, that it might one day feel like something benign, but it never does. If you were a courtesan, you would know that the light was not only for beauty, it was for scrutiny. The client sits already waiting. His posture is relaxed, but his eyes track every movement you make. You think the gaze would feel flattering, but it is only another measure, another silent ledger no one bothers to write down. You kneel and bow. The silk of your robe sighs across the floor as you arrange yourself into the precise shape of welcome. He says your name as though he owns it, as though it is a token he purchased and now expects you to validate. You think you could correct him, remind him that the name is only borrowed, that you belong to no one. But instead, you incline your head, because contradiction is not part of what you sell. He asks if you have missed him. You answer without hesitation, yes. The word is smooth as lacquer, so familiar it feels almost honest. You think the lie would grow easier each time, but the ease is what unsettles you most. He reaches for your hand. The warmth of his palm is at odds with the cool composure you wear. For a moment you let him hold it, though you feel nothing in that touch except the slight, practiced pressure that says you are listening. When you pull your hand back, he does not protest. He only studies your face as though he can read in your expression the shape of all your hidden truths. But you know better. In this place, no gaze ever truly penetrates the lacquer. It slides over the surface, collecting only what you allow it to collect. Once, in your first year, you believed that being looked at meant being seen. You thought the right man might find the person you still were beneath the painted mask. You have since learned that the gaze is only a mirror. It reflects the longing of the one who watches, never the reality of the one who is watched. You think this should have made you bitter, but it has only made you patient. When he asks if you are content, you answer the same as always, I am. You hear how even your voice has learned to carry the words without flinching. The tea grows cold in its cup between you. Neither of you moves to drink it. It is only a prop, part of the ritual that lets the evening proceed without interruption. You think you could feel disdain for this charade, but you find instead that you feel nothing at all. When he stands to leave, you bow, the movement so graceful it almost feels real. The matron steps into the doorway as he departs. She meets your eyes for the briefest moment. There is no question there, no curiosity. Only the silent confirmation that you have done what you were meant to do. And as the door slides shut, you remain kneeling, your hands folded in your lap. You think the room would feel emptier without his gaze, but it feels exactly the same. You rise slowly, feeling the lamps on your skin like a scrutiny that never ends. You slip into the hallway after the door has closed, your steps careful against the polished boards. You think the emptiness might feel like freedom, some brief interval that belongs only to you. But even here you feel the ledger waiting, patient as a promise you never made. If you were a courtesan, you would know that the accounts were not only numbers. They were stories, ones you never agreed to tell but would be made to repeat until the end. At the far end of the hall, the matron sits beside the folding screen. The lamp next to her burns low, casting a shallow pool of light that makes the shadows look deeper. You think she must be tired, but her posture is as composed as ever, her hands resting on the closed ledger, as though it were something alive. She gestures, and you cross the room without hurry. When you kneel, the tatami beneath you feels cooler than the air. 3 guests, she says. Her voice has the same inflectionless calm as always. You have never heard her speak in any other tone. She opens the ledger. The paper catches the light, the ink shining dark where it has been pressed into the fibers. You think you could look away, that you could pretend the record does not matter, but you do not. Each line is read aloud, as if naming the sum will make it easier to bear. 2 cups of incense, hair dressing, garment laundering, tea sweets. You think these details would feel trivial, but they are never trivial here. Each one is another stitch in the garment that binds you to this place. Once, you thought the ledger was only a tool, but you have come to understand it is also an inheritance, a thing passed down from every woman who knelt here before you. The matron pauses. For a moment you almost believe she will say something different, something kind, but she does not. She only inclines her head. You bow, because this is how the ritual ends. She dips the brush into the ink and records your acknowledgement, the mark precise as a blade. You think you could ask her how many more entries will come before your name is no longer written here, but you already know she will not answer. When she closes the ledger, the sound is soft but final. You think you could rise immediately, but instead, you remain kneeling a little longer, feeling the hush gather around you. In that moment, you understand that the ledger has become a kind of mirror. It reflects not your face, but the shape of your endurance, traced in depths no one else will ever see. The matron's shadow passes over you as she stands. She does not look back. When you finally rise, you step away slowly, as if the paper memory might cling to your sleeves. In the corridor, the lamps burn brighter than before. You think their glow might feel forgiving, but it only sharpens the knowledge that the ledger will wait for you tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. And as you walk away, you feel the invisible ink pressed into your skin, a ledger you will never set down. You return to your chamber at last, the corridor silent, except for the hush of your own breath. You think the darkness behind the sliding door would feel like a retreat, some private space beyond the reach of ledgers and lamps. But in Yoshiwara, the night was never only yours. If you were a courtesan, you would know this hour as the moment when the walls felt closest. The moment when your body was too tired to pretend, but the ritual still waited to be completed. You kneel by the brazier and stir the coals with the iron tongs, watching the embers blink awake. Their glow casts a thin light across your folded robe, the comb set neatly atop it. You think you could leave the coals to die out, that you could let the darkness take everything. But habit steadies your hand. You arrange your bedding with the same careful precision you brought to serving tea. Each crease smoothed, each edge aligned, as if order could stand in for peace. Once you believed that if you performed every task correctly, the day might end differently, that some small grace would arrive, unbidden, to ease the weight of what you carried. You no longer believe that. The matron passes the doorway, her steps measured as always. She does not pause. No words are spoken. You think you might wish for them, but you also know you would not have the strength to answer. You sit on the edge of the bedding and uncoil your hair, feeling the slow relief as each pin slips free. The strands fall across your shoulders in a heavy curtain that smells of incense and camellia oil. You think the gesture would feel like liberation. But it is only the rehearsal of another role, the woman who sleeps, who dreams, who might wake to a different story. In the dark, you lift your hands to your face. You trace the line of your cheek, the place where the rouge has stained your skin a faint, persistent red. You think you could scrub it away, but you do not. The quiet here is complete. No voices drift through the screens. No footsteps pause outside. It is the closest you will come to solitude. And even here you feel the ledger in the corner of your mind, waiting to tally the hours you will spend pretending you do not remember. You think you could surrender to sleep, but your body holds the memory of every step you have taken today, the bowing and kneeling, the smooth offering of words you never meant, the patient performance of being untouched by any of it. You lie down slowly, the quilt pulled over your shoulders. The embers crackle behind you. You think the small warmth would feel comforting, but it is too thin, too brief. When you close your eyes, the darkness is no softer than the lamplight. It is only a different shape of vigilance. You think you will dream of something gentler, but you already know you will dream of this room, this hour, this same moment repeating itself like a story you cannot stop telling. In Yoshiwara, the night never truly ended. It only folded itself into the next day, carrying the same debts, the same questions, the same quiet refusal to let you go. And so you lie still, listening to the hush grow deeper, feeling the memory of every lamp and ledger settle into your bones, waiting to be carried again tomorrow. The lamps have dimmed now, their glow receding into quiet corners you can finally ignore. You lie there, the hush pressing close, as if it might smooth the sharpness of all you have carried. You think tomorrow will be different, but you already know this story is content to repeat itself, patient as the ledger, soft as the weight of your robe. So you breathe, because breathing is all that remains untouched. You let the darkness unfold around you, neither cruel nor kind, only constant. And now, as you lie there, you know the loop will wait once more for you.